Madam President,
Senator from Illinois,
I'd like consent to speak in morning business,
without objection.
and I will yield when the Minority Leader, Senator Schumer, comes to the floor. Madam President, a recent briefing told us a story which most Americans can certainly understand. People are saying, I can't afford to have cancer. What does that mean? Well, it means the obvious. 40% of Americans lose their entire life savings in 2 years or less after a cancer diagnosis. The cost of health care, particularly for serious illness, is so high that if you don't have a really, really good health insurance plan, it'll wipe you out. That's the reality. And so is it any wonder that we are concerned about the lawsuit filed by the Trump administration, supported by Republican state attorneys general, that would remove the guarantee in the law that says that people with pre-existing conditions can have health insurance? That to me is fundamental. Over a majority of Americans either have a pre-existing condition or have someone in their family with such a condition. And without the protection of health insurance, they can find themselves literally wiped out. When we hear that fewer than 50% of the people in this country have $1,000 in savings, we can understand that even a trip to an emergency room could wipe out the meager savings people have been able to put together during the course of their lifetime. Why do the Republicans and why does this president still seem determined to lessen the coverage of health insurance for an American population that is so vulnerable to the high cost of health care? And when you ask the major insurance companies what's driving up the cost of health insurance premiums, they tell you it's pretty obvious. More than anything, it's the cost of prescription drugs. President Trump announced his plans for re-election last night in Florida. I guess my first question to him is, will you finish what you promised 4 years ago? Because two of the things he promised, infrastructure and doing something about prescription drugs, he's done nothing. How bad is the prescription drug situation in this country? Well, as I said, it's the biggest driver of the increase in health insurance premiums. And you look at the specifics, you can see it. Take a look at America's insulin scandal. Insulin was discovered almost 100 years ago by two Canadian researchers who surrendered the U.S. patent rights for $1 and said at the time, no one should ever get rich on this life-saving drug. Now look at what we're faced with. Humalog, made by Eli Lilly, a common insulin product. Humalog cost $21 a vial in 1996. Today, that same vial of Humalog costs $275. $21 to $275, unless you live in Canada. If you live in Canada, the exact drug made by the same company sells for $39. $39 just across the border in Canada, $275 here in the United States. Is it any wonder that people with diabetes are rationing their insulin, and in doing that, endangering their health and sadly, many losing their lives because of that decision? Why aren't we taking this on? The American people identified as one of their major concerns when it comes to their economic vulnerability. We're not taking it on because of the political muscle of pharma and the pharmaceutical companies. They have this, sadly, this chamber in a position where we're not entertaining legislation that would control prescription drug pricing. And frankly, we have no legislative proposal coming forward by the Trump administration. There are many good ideas out there. For example, do you ever see an ad for a pharmaceutical drug on television? If you don't, then you don't own a television. You can barely turn them on now without some ad for pharma drugs. It reaches a point where people learn how to pronounce and even spell Xarelto, having watched the ad so many times. And they can recite back to you what is said about various drugs that are advertised over and over again. And the problem is, of course, is that all of the information they give you, as fast as they can talk in 60 or 90 seconds, never includes the price. Never includes the price. Humira, the most heavily advertised drug on television today. How much does it cost for this drug to treat psoriatic arthritis and to clear up the little red spot of psoriasis on your elbow. It costs $5,000 a month. $5,000 a month. If they were forced to advertise the price of the drug with all of the claims that they make for the drugs, Americans would at least be notified about what they're getting into if they go to a doctor and ask for Humira. But they won't. They refuse to disclose it. So, in fairness, the Trump administration, Dr. Azar, head of HHS, called me last year and said he supported the bill that I'd introduced calling for price disclosure. The administration is trying to do this by regulation, and I applaud them for that. There's so much more we can do, but I applaud them for that. And who turned around to sue them in court to stop the requirement of price disclosure on ads? The pharmaceutical companies, including Eli Lilly, the one I just mentioned that has the scandalous pricing of insulin. They don't want Americans to know what they're charging for these drugs. They'd rather fight this out over emails between insurance companies and prescription benefit managers and the like. Well, it's time for us as a Congress, Democrats and Republicans, to acknowledge we've had enough of this. We want pharma to be profitable so that they engage in more research for more cures, of course. But we can't stand by idly and watch just price gouging at the expense of American patients, those with diabetes and other serious conditions. We should insist when it comes to pharma that they have actual price competition. They can have a patent period where they have exclusive rights to sell a drug. That's the incentive for them to discover these drugs. But there comes a point when there's supposed to be other drugs in the market, generic drugs, that offer the same benefits as the original brand name drug, but at a much lower price. That was the design of the system. It has fallen apart. The major drugs for sale in the United States today are going up precipitously in price. In the first 2 years of the Trump administration, 2,500 major drugs in this country saw their costs increase by double digits. That's what we're faced with while the Senate does nothing. Senator McConnell was here today speaking about the agenda and what we need to do. Well, I certainly agree with him. The situation at our border needs to be addressed and should be quickly. We're going to take it up this morning in the Appropriations Committee. But beyond that, we need to take a step to deal with the issues that people really care about, issues that affect their daily lives. And number one on that list, and they tell us number one on their own list, is the cost of prescription drugs. Now is the time for this Congress and Senate to act. You see this empty chamber? It should be filled with members of the Senate debating bills to bring down the high cost of prescription drugs. Instead, it is silent, and the best we can do is to get a speech from a senator from Illinois. So I hope that someone's listening, and I certainly hope Senator McConnell's office is listening. Madam President, I ask consent that at a separate place of the record, my remarks on the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act be
Without
entered.
objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.